All right, hello everybody. Sorry I am a couple minutes late. Had to restart the good old computer to get that webcam feed working, but hello everybody. This is EdmontonPy. Sorry I missed January, but we're here in February. Um, my name is Aaron, and here I just wanted to also shout out a couple of our affiliates in Calgary. They've helped us out, especially during the last 2 to 3 years of helping co-organize and find presenters. So just wanted to shout out YYC Data as well as Pi YYC. They are excellent folk over there. And for us at Edmonton Pi, right now you can find us on Slack. I have shared the link in the video description. So with that, we also have our YouTube videos on the Dev Edmonton YouTube that you can all see us from. And with that, I'm going to take the slides away from here. So before I go any further, I just want to thank Edmonton Unlimited. They have in the past offered a lot of things to us, including being able to support us in the virtual capacity as well. So I think in this upcoming year, I'll be looking forward to seeing if we can get back to some more in-person events. But for now, we're going to be chilling, meeting here virtually, and yeah, away we go. So I just wanted to start off with a couple job postings that I discovered while I was quickly glancing and creating the slides here. So I just wanted to talk about in Edmonton, I believe, Stantec is Edmonton based, and currently they are looking for a Python and Django developer. So pretty relevant to kind of what I was talking about earlier. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, I think Stantec is a professional services company. They specialize in design and consulting. And yeah, I kind of looked at it. I believe they're looking for someone with intermediate experience. So with the other two job postings, I think they are remote friendly, but I am not quite sure. I do know that Muckrack is looking for a senior engineer with more backend experience, and they are a PR and communications platform. And with Sentry, or CodeCov, I discovered as I was creating these slides that, yeah, Sentry has purchased CodeCov, so I thought that was pretty cool. And Sentry themselves are looking for a senior backend engineer as well with Python experience. I couldn't fit everything on there. I wouldn't let, the kind of news lately about a couple of the bigger companies, scare you away from searching for jobs, especially with Python. As I was just kind of looking up some things, it yielded a few good nuggets just by searching, especially locally. So, but I kind of wanted to end the job postings with a link there to the Django community jobs listings. And because I couldn't fit all of them, if you're looking for a job or looking to hire great people, feel free to join our Dev Edmonton Slack and hop onto the opportunities channel. All right, so some of the news and articles. It's been a couple months since we met, so couldn't fit all of what's happened, but I always like to kind of talk about, the newer versions of Python. Let's take a look. I believe with 3.11, some of the major benefits is it's about 10 to 60% faster than Python 3.10. So, anytime the Python team is helping all of our applications get faster, it almost feels like a bit of a cheat code. I thought that was pretty cool. And a couple changes, I think, in Python 3.11 that I really liked. Is PEP 657. They've got fine-grained error locations and tracebacks. So if your application crashes or it has an uncaught exception, now it kind of pinpoints you more closely to where it's having trouble. And with PEP 654, I thought it was pretty cool to have exception groups and except star. And as part of the talk for today, I believe I was just taking a look at Django, and actually today there might actually be version 4.1.7 coming out. Not going to hold them to it, but yeah, I think it's cool to see that Django has been patching, a couple CVEs when they notice them and can get them out. So good to patch up Django, make sure that your web applications are up to snuff security wise. And whenever they go from a 4.x release, sometimes you get some pretty cool features as well. In terms of podcasts, I thought it was pretty interesting to listen to Talk Python to me, migrating 3.8 million lines of Python. And what is that about? Well, that's about moving from Python 2 to 3. And while we've been on Python 3 for quite a while now, well, there's still going to be legacy code. And I thought it was an interesting talk about the lessons learned in migrating such a massive code base and the challenges and the triumphs that this individual experienced as well as on their team. So I like to joke that it might also be just a great insight into job security in a sense. If developers are writing code, well, that code may become legacy code. So yeah, pretty interesting podcast. And the other one, Real Python Podcast 144, wrangling business process models with Python and Spiff workflow. So I thought it was an interesting take where they've got a Spiff workflow based on my quick glance of what it does. It's diagrams that also run in Python. So that means it's a low coding solution that does appeal to me because it eliminates the part that I dislike the most, which is creating diagrams after the fact or before I get to work on something. If I'm able to create a workflow in something like Spiff workflow and already have some of the logic, even if it's not perfect, getting it started, I think is what's most important. So I thought that was a fairly interesting podcast to listen to. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to now flip over. Hopefully, come on OBS. I'm going to flip over to our main presentation here, which is on the history of Django. So if there are any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. And if I can't answer them live, I'll do my best to answer them at the end of the presentation. Alrighty. Let's flip over. And I need to go over to my presentation. Right on. Okay. So it's titled The Unofficial History of Django because, yeah, I don't want to get any lawyers involved. I'm sure the Django Software Foundation are pretty, reasonable people, but I'll just say before I start that this was mostly myself doing my own little research on a framework that, I started my career and enjoyed building a lot of applications with. And you know what? After I looked through its history and looked at where it's at today, anyways, don't want to jump into the rest of the slides here. I'll talk more about it, that's for sure. Okay, so what are the topics that I'm going to cover tonight? Well, first of all, I think that the target audience, I'm trying to make this something that can appeal to, a lot of different individuals. So what does that mean? That means, first I'm going to talk about very quickly what is Django if you're not familiar. And then I'll dive into kind of the major milestones as, Django's been around for a while. And it's gone through and seen a lot of different changes to web and web technologies. Then, after I've gone through the major milestones, I'll also talk about, after I've worked in Django for a few years, what are my opinions? What are my own sort of personal criticisms? Because no software is perfect. And even though Django's been around for a long time, there's kind of, good things and things that, when I have my own preferences. So we'll go into that. And one of the things that I'll wrap up with is, well, how big's the community around Django? Who else is out there using it? What's available both online as well as in person. And I'll kind of wrap up with just kind of closing statements about what I feel about the future of Django as a framework itself. Okay, so what is Django? they like to build themselves as the web framework for perfectionists with deadlines. And to me, to kind of break that down into what I think that means, I think that Django is kind of this framework that some people might say, well, it's got too much. You don't need all of what Django gives you because it gives you the kitchen sink. One thing that I do like about Django is that despite it being something that's a kitchen sink or a batteries included full stack web framework, you don't have to use all of it. And the parts that you don't use don't really bog down the rest of the bits that you decide to make use of. The other thing about Django that makes it great for perfectionists with deadlines is that it has sane defaults and it's security minded. And it's gotten even better at that as we go through the major milestones in a bit. I really do believe that Django really tries to help the newest developers and even the most seasoned ones not forget and also make improvements to their applications so that when they reach production, more people can rest assured, the developers included, that what they're deploying is ready for the internet. The other thing too about Django is that it's very versatile and it's got a lot of community support, especially for something that's been around, since, I believe, well, we'll see the timeline in a moment. But it's definitely been around for over a decade. And because of that, it's also got a very comprehensive and easy first steps to be able to get started. So, and just a little fun fact, why was it named Django? Well, it was named after the jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt by the original creators of the Django framework. So, all right, the major milestones. I'm going to be talking about, can't be talking about every single version. They've got a ton of release notes. And as I was compiling the major milestones, I, started from the very beginning, kind of tried to see if there were any official sources or as official as I can find. And I referred to the Django release notes, the Wikipedia, especially the table of versions, because the Django release notes no longer really talk about some of the older version 1 and older things. So thanks Wikipedia for that. And the Quora link, I have the link in the video description as well. It's actually got a response from one of the original co-authors about how Django even started. So I'm not going to do it justice. I can only really summarize it, but it's a great and interesting read, that's for sure. The web was a much simpler time, let's put it that way. Okay, so let's see, pre 0.95. So this was between the years 2003 to 2005. So that means it's been 20 years since Django was the twinkle in someone's eye. And for the original creators, they were going from they wanted to see if there was something better than what PHP could offer them at the time. And this is not a dig at PHP. I think that PHP has made a lot of improvements. There are just as good frameworks in the PHP language as well. But back in 2003, the early versions of Django was developed in a newsroom where deadlines were really important, and the co-authors, the creators of Django, wanted to not repeat themselves. They wanted a way to build a content management system that followed some sort of defined standards and could also scale. They couldn't find that with the what PHP was at the time. Things like namespacing, for example, weren't available. PHP was quite strictly, just a pure scripting language without some of the things like, object-oriented programming and even, the mature frameworks that really help get developers started. So, just even in this bullet point here, CSS was new age tech back in early 2000s. So that should kind of tell you how many things we take for granted nowadays were just, very nascent, very brand new to a lot of people, a lot of developers at the time. And so when the creators in their news company were developing Django, they wanted to see, more consistent URL patterning, sorry, and they also wanted to create a content management system admin, which for those who do use Django, now we know that as the Django admin. Other things too that we still use in Django, like the HTTP request and response. Back then, WSGI or WSGI, which now is considered kind of the older technology, even WSGI did not exist back in the early 2000s. So, Django really pioneered a lot of what I think we take for granted today, if not just in Django, but also just in terms of the terminologies that we use when we develop web applications. And it's really good news. It's why I'm here today and able to do this presentation, that the Newsroom company would eventually be convinced to open source what is now known as Django. That's pretty great. Okay, so now they've got some version numbers on this, starting from March 23rd, 2007, or maybe even earlier. These dates are always a little fuzzy when you kind of rewind the clock a little too much. But with version 0.95 and 96, the theme was about removing some of the magic things in Django itself. So that meant less automatic code. So they realized that, being too opinionated about what might be helpful, like automatically putting plurals on everything, might not work for, outside of their Newsroom company. And to them, they felt, what, we don't have this. It actually leads to, less trouble. Other things too are, well, if other people are to be able to use Django, in Python, we need to use our import statements and the module names, knowing where something is, being able to, even though our IDEs, our code editors now, they autocomplete so much of our import statements. Sometimes it's still good to, in a pinch, kind of know, okay, is it Django.db, right? These things were still being defined back in 2007. And with that, they knew that if other developers are to build their applications with Django, they needed to start to create an API that was more stable. So that was pre-version 1. But already they were starting to think about, a lot of important considerations about allowing for a larger community to make use of the software that the original creators made just for their Newsroom company. Well, with version 1.0 on September 3rd, 2008, they believed that they achieved enough to essentially say, what, from here, Django is not only going to be backwards compatible, but they had this ambitious goal of being forwards compatible to allow for developers to be able to easily upgrade to newer versions and have enough deprecation warnings to be given heads up about, hey, these items, they will go away eventually, so we're here to give you a heads up. And, even today, I'm sure we all appreciate Django's more forwards compatible thinking and stable APIs. So in 2008, they were able to achieve the decoupling of, its admin and the models. So once again, if you don't need the Django admin, but you need your data models and the ORM, well, you can do that. And they started that in version 1.0. Back in 2008, I think this was the very first iPhone came out back in 2008. Even back then, they could predict that, stronger Unicode support would be important. And, I purposely used an emoji there because I still remember, early on when things were not all Unicode. And without Unicode, there would not be the kind of fancy emojis that we can all just use even in our slides. And I don't recommend it, but you can even use, I think, emojis in your code comments and whatnot. So yeah, stronger Unicode support back in 2008. Pretty forward-looking from the Django team. Other things as well is they started to look into, again, with the same defaults and more security mindedness, they had cross-site scripting mitigation. So with the Django templating language, they realized that, auto-escaping the outputs while one could argue that that is kind of magic. They decided, you know what, it's sensible, it's justified, because if we auto escape the outputs, then it far reduces the risk of anything inside of the templates themselves from running arbitrary code that a developer did not expect their application to run. Because yeah, with cross-site scripting, you probably don't want that in your website. And if you need to turn off the auto escape, well, they have a template tag for that too. So they were thinking about the flexibility, but what is also sensible, all the way back in version 1 in 2008. As just a quick aside, it's not really part of the Django framework itself, but Django REST Framework 0.1. I had to dig into their GitHub repo for this one, but this, I think I saw that they put the tag on February 21st, 2011. So I kind of joke that a small library appears because honestly, Django REST Framework would make a fairly big splash on the web development scene. I heavily made use of Django REST Framework in my own career. And to know that in 2011, that's when 0.1 came out, well, from there, it would pioneer API-driven Django development. And something that I really like about Django REST Framework is it adopts the philosophy of the Django team itself and helps newer developers like myself back then, get up to speed with how to use Django REST Framework. It has quick and simple tutorials, just like the bog standard Django web framework does. So just as a quick aside, wanted to shout out Django REST Framework here. All right, so we'll fast forward just a little bit into 2012. And this is where Django had its first long-term support. So that meant that, for about 3 years, they would apply security patches on version 1.4 of Django. And that really appeals to, companies that, especially larger companies with bigger teams and more cross-functional teams. They need some sort of even more API stability than even just, Django itself can provide. And so being able to say, hey, we can stay on version 1.4 and not rock the boat too hard for the next couple of years while still getting the security patches, that appeals to a lot of larger teams and a lot of larger businesses. So with Django 1.4, or technically 1.3, a pretty big change, a pretty big introduction happened. I wouldn't call it a change. It's better to say that class-based views, while sometimes being a time saver, were introduced in version 1.3. With Django, you don't need to use your class-based views. You can still use just a function-based view that receives an HTTP request, but if you find that your use case helps to use inheritable, mixable class-based views, that became available with version 1.3, and a lot more teams and businesses got that benefit with version 1.4. Another big thing, remember this was in 2012, I think, at least in my experience, time zone support is just, it's a must-have nowadays. I personally don't build any application without time zone support because, you can't really predict if or when your application or your website might need to be used by someone in a different time zone from yourself. And back in 2012, Django saw that this can be important. So Django as a framework went from, using naive date times, otherwise known as date times that don't have a time zone attached to them. Well, Django itself, as a framework, started to make sure that their internal date time usage had time zone logic. Another thing too is cross-site request forgery, otherwise known as CSRF, is another security vulnerability. And in order to mitigate that, Django in their templates can inject like a unique cookie into a user's browser. Now, I'm no security expert, so that was probably like a super short summary of what's going on there. But with the template, or not template, but with the view Python view decorator, ensure CSRF cookie. It's declarative, it's clear in your your controller that here's an operation that is dealing with sensitive data, and it makes it easy to just make sure we get to lock that down and prevent a bad actor from being able to impersonate your server to the client. So yeah, I thought that was pretty great, and it came out in 2012. Another thing too that basically is taken for granted is that Django in 2012 started to use PBKDF2 as their password storage algorithm. Now, even to this day, that is still the password storage algorithm that is recommended by NIST. That's an American, I think, government body. Could be wrong, but they, have a lot of what I would say are trustworthy recommendations around security best practices. And sure, today in 2023, there are even stronger algorithms than PBK DF2, but it's still a fine algorithm to use today, and it was something that was introduced in Django over 10 years ago. And I thought this was a really good long-term support version because they also were able to create a new project layout that meant that newer projects had a better starting point, in the sense that they learned kind of how do other developers lay out, organize a Django application. And the other thing too was manage.py. They made it less terrifying for another developer to be able to go in to the pre-generated manage.py. And while they don't need, I never really made too many customizations in that file. If a developer has to, they are able to without foot gunning themselves. So yeah, I'm talking so much about this long-term support version because I've had personal experience kind of working a lot with 1.4, and I thought the Django team and the open source community did a wonderful job making 1.4 the very first LTS, and it had end of life 3 years later in October 1st, 2015. So it had a pretty long life going for it. So, well, with one LTS comes a second one. And so before 1.4 LTS went EOL, or end of life, 1.8 was declared as the second LTS. And it fell on April 1st, but, they reassured us it was not an April Fool's joke. And once again, with this long-term support version, businesses and larger teams were able to get the benefits of some features that were introduced in prior versions of Django. A couple of them. One in 1.7, Django introduced a built-in database schema migration solution. So before Django 1.7, a lot of teams were either hand rolling their database migrations. And if you're not familiar with that, I guess my quickest explanation I can give is if you have a relational database with tables and relations, and you're making a change in one table's, columns, or even, the data types that the columns have, or you're changing the constraints on a table or multiple tables. In order to have your application be backwards compatible, you need to be able to, not even backwards compatible. Well, if you want your application to be able to take the Django models and migrate the code from the old definition of your database to the new definition, you're going to probably need some sort of a migration strategy. And prior to 1.7, developers were either writing their own SQL scripts to, those alter table statements that some of us, if we can avoid doing them, we try to, or other developers were using a third-party library called South that I enjoyed using up until 1.7, when there was that transition period from using a third-party library, South, to giving the built-in migration solution a try. With 1.8, they also made Django support not just the built-in Django template rendering engine, but also a really popular pre-existing one called Jinja 2. So this is Django kind of becoming a little bit more agnostic in terms of, if you prefer using Jinja 2 for your templating language, for your view layer, you can, starting with 1.8. Another thing that they incorporated into the standard version of Django were some major Django secure features. And again, that's the Django and open source community finding that if everyone is basically pulling in these features, we may as well add it into the standard framework. And with 1.8, I felt like they really supercharged the object relational models. Is that even the right acronym for ORM? Well, anyways, that's why I use acronyms. So the ORM additions, technically starting from 1.7, they added ways to create sort of what are you can create these convenience methods, so you don't have to type out a long, ORM, function chained, query, just to get a query set. So you're able to sort of create these convenience methods and then also create model managers from them. And a lot of these links here have examples of what benefits that can offer you. Another thing too is to really help with more control over making your database queries more efficient, but also declarative, is these prefetch objects. So being able to instruct Django and fine tune, hey, what fields in this query that I'm writing, we want Django to pull ahead of time so that we don't need it to do another join. These prefetch objects give the developers more control over that, where they need it. And then with 1.8, they added even more fine-grained and advanced control over your query sets in the form of query and conditional expressions. There could be a whole talk on just that on its own, but I've provided links there for further perusal. And again, the link to the slides will be in the video description. And last but definitely not least, even more database functions. So if you've written raw SQL before and you've used things like aggregate, sum and whatnot, those are also exposed starting in 1.8 as sort of Python functions in the Django ORM. And again, these LTS, they have so many features, but I find that they do a great job of introducing enough features while keeping an API stable for 3 years, such that development teams don't really feel like they need to constantly be upgrading and migrating their Django code itself. They can kind of do that, every 2 to 3 years and give, not only their teams, but other teams a heads up as to when and how they're going to go about making those upgrades. All right, so 1.11. Again, you're starting to notice a pattern with the milestones here. This is their third long-term support version, and this one is on April 4th, 2017. One that didn't have as much change as the previous long-term support versions, and I believe the reason why was because they wanted to. This was the final version for major version 1. They wanted to allow for the Django community to prepare for Django 2.0, and they didn't want to rock the boat too much. But at the same time, they knew that any major version changes, they still wanted to provide bigger teams and larger businesses along that 2 to 3 year horizon with these LTS versions to get familiar with what is going to change in 2.0 while still allowing their businesses, their applications to run on version 1. So, very minor changes with 1.11. The ones I wanted to highlight are, a little bit of cleaner code because now your database models, to kind of one of the, performance enhancements that can be done is to declare indexes on, one or more columns. And before, I believe you kind of needed to dig into an undocumented model.meta object, but with 1.11 they made that a formal API and they made it class-based, so it looked a bit more declarative, and was much easier to declare, hey, with this model, with this or a group of columns, I want to declare this index, and there's already a Django Python class created for that. Another thing that they did was, with forms are comprised of widgets, for lack of a better term, and the widgets can be, I like to think of them as like, one or a group of fields, usually just one field, an input field of some sort for a user. And, they have a templating engine for the view layer, so they kind of figured, why are we making developers have to define their form widgets, which get rendered to HTML anyways? Why was that controlled with pure Python? So they moved from just pure Python to allowing developers to author their form widgets using the template rendering engine using HTML. And just a couple little more ORM additions. So if the prefetch and select related wasn't enough, now developers can sort of pre-declare subquery objects to really get that fine tuning down, and exists. I thought that was it was just something that when I was using pre 1.11, I was like, I do that so often. It's good to see that with 1.11 they introduce it as a formal, part of the ORM instead of you having to manually write out the SQL inside of the Python. So less change, but it allowed for the Django community to prepare for version 2.0. Okay. Version 2.0 came out shortly after 1.11 LTS, so still in 2017, but just on that tail end. With 2.0, ironically, Django 2.0 said goodbye to Python 2.x. And honestly, for the Python community back then and even today, Python 2, it was a long time coming. Being stuck on 2.7, they had to draw a line at some point, and with 2.0 they said that now is the time. And from that point forward, the Django versioning kind of took a more Semver-esque convention, and I'm going to allow for the people watching this to take a look at what Semver is. But the Django team said, you know what, we're not going to follow it by the book, but at the same time, it's still good to just try to adopt some of the parts that they could about semantic versioning for the Django project. And as we look at the milestones, I think it led to, just from a naive standpoint, the version numbers, increasing a bit more. But that allowed for the amount of change between versions to kind of be like less. And so like rocking the boat became less of a thing, and they were able to continue their philosophy of keeping a stable API becoming a forwards compatible framework. Another thing that I was very relieved to see with version 2.0 is a much more simplified URL routing syntax. So before 2.0, and eventually as you work with Django more and more often, you almost sort of just get used to it. But as you can see with this code snippet in the before section, you had to write this very regexy, regular expression heavy, I like to call it an incantation, because this is a toy example. I have seen some URL routing patterns that, as a developer, it is hard to read. Sure, it's really advanced, and I believe that Django still allows you, where you need it, to define your URL patterns using the older syntax. However, for most cases, being able to just declare with far less typing that here's my pattern, here's the data type, and here's the variable I want you as Django to capture, this data type as a Python variable, just a whole lot clearer. And I was very relieved to see that with version 2. And another great thing is 2.0, especially with 2017, they were, I would say, I know my hot takes are supposed to show up later, but I would say it was kind of a long time coming for the Django admin to be mobile friendly. But hey, they got it done with version 2.0. So we were all pretty happy when that happened. All right, so with more long-term support versions, 1.11 could only last for 3 years, and eventually Django teams would have to migrate to something in the 2.x flavor. So they released once again in 2019 on April 1st, but their release cadence is kind of, with these LTS versions, is every 2 years. So all right, I'll give them a break this time again. With 2.2, again, there wasn't too much rocking of the boat. I thought that once again, they created kind of ORM functions to kind of formalize the things that maybe in the past we would have to kind of write more SQL statements or just do it in an unPythonic or un-ORM-like way. The two that I really liked are the check constraints and the unique constraints. That allows for developers to say, look, for example, I want this column to be unique. However, only unique if, this query set's conditions are all satisfied. Otherwise, the rest of the values don't have to be unique. I think for those who understand how powerful that is, being able to just declare that without writing too much, SQL and Django, that was super helpful. Similarly, having more fine-grained control over what database checks happen upon, a save or an update on a query set. Once again, you can have more fine-grained control over the condition that the database should be checking your save and update operations. So that was pretty cool. All right, big version 3.0. So around 2 years later, on December 2nd, 2019, Django itself, if we can rewind the clock again, it started back in 2003 and 2005. And that was before WSGI was a thing. But now fast forward to 2019, and suddenly Django, to some people who never used Django, they said, oh no, Django, what, old school stuff. It's not even using this newfangled new kid on the block called ASGI, which is a spiritual successor to the synchronous, HTTP focused WSGI layer. So Django themselves, they're not usually the first to adopt the newest, shiniest technologies, but when they do adopt it, they try to do it sensibly again to have a stable API, to be forwards compatible. But changing, again with Semver, changing the major version, the leftmost value, does mean that they can start to make breaking changes. But with Django, not a lot of things break when you move to the major versions, at least in my experience. So with version 3.0, this was the first thing I wanted to highlight is that they officially supported another relational database that is very popular in the community called MariaDB. And MariaDB started, I believe, as a MySQL fork, and it's still got a strong and vibrant community. So it's good to see, Django have official support for, a database, a relational database that has a pretty healthy adoption. But really, what is interesting with 3.0 is that Django itself started to support ASGI, as I like to call it, ASGI. And specifically, the parts that Django still wasn't async capable were in 3.0 is their middleware. the view layer and the ORM, among other smaller things. But I believe in 3.0, the ASCII capableness of Django was kind of more under the hood. There wasn't really much practical ways for a Django developer to start to use ASCII within just standard Django on its own. But that changed pretty quick. So on April 6th, 2021, Django introduced the concept of async views and middleware. So now, as Django developers, we've got practical async usage. So what does that mean? Well, I think that means that, I just wanted to be clear here. This was not the class-based views yet. This is still using just the functional views. Those can be now async capable. And if your middleware is properly defined, those operations could also have async await, written in the code base. And of course, with your async views and middleware, your testing has got to also be async aware. So, their testing also had that capability. And, by 3.x, the Django models was already very, very powerful. But now it had the ability to do what's called functional indexes. So even more fine-grained control in being able to, in a more declarative way, inside of Python and Django itself, say, here's what my model looks like, and here's its index definition. So the advantage of this is you don't have to jump out of Django, out of Python, and have to go into your database as much to describe that table, to describe its columns and how, what's its schema. And last but definitely not least, by this time in 2021, there was more support in non-Postgres databases for the JSON data type. So while JSON field, I believe, started as a Postgres only model field, it became kind of database agnostic starting in 3.1 and 3.2 LTS. So pretty cool. Again, very incremental changes, but they are nice to have. Okay, so with version 4, they made 4.0 a long-term support version. Before that, usually kind of the first major version wasn't an LTS. So this time it was interesting and fairly ambitious for Django and the open source community to say, what, with this major version, this is going to be the long-term support version. So December 7th, 2021, the big thing that happened was the another venerable Python package, PyTZ. Once we went to Python 3, Python already came built in with a time zone library module, called zone info. So with version 4.0, Python replaced its dependency on PyTZ with using Python 3.x's zone info module. I believe in Django 3.x, they were giving developers kind of a heads up saying, hey, we've said goodbye to Python 2 already. Just a heads up, to not rock the boat too much. We're still using PyTZ, but, Python already comes built in with zone info. So with 4.0, they did the replacement because they gave enough heads up in 3.2 LTS and so on and so forth. And, earlier I was talking about the, form widgets being rendered using a template engine. Well, they extended that to kind of just the whole forms itself. So obviously you still have your Django forms, form set, and error list Python classes. But now within the class definitions, you can say, here's the template file .html that, this form renders into. So that, I think, was a much wiser, more intuitive separation of concerns, where you still have your Python classes, but as with these forms, form sets, error lists, widgets, they get rendered to HTML, giving developers the ability to control their rendering using the template engine, the HTML template engine, whether or not that was Jinja 2 or the built-in Django template engine, was a very wise change. And like I mentioned earlier, PBKDF2, although today it is still, I believe, NIST recommended, as computers get more and more advanced and faster, the password hashing and password storage algorithms do need to keep up. And so back in 2021, it wasn't made the default password hashing algorithm, but Django did allow you to opt in to using a more stronger hasher called scrypt. So that was good to see. And this was, back in 2021. And I felt this was kind of a long time coming as well. But they finally, with Django 4.0, had built in Redis cache support. Now, no, I don't want to dig Django too hard on this because I believe the large community support around Django built a couple really reliable Redis cache backends for to allow Django and Redis to talk in between one another. But again, hey, it's good to see that the Django community saw, well, you know what, Redis has become so popular, and so many of us are using these well-built third-party packages that, hey, let's roll in one to make it built in. Because the development community has spoken. Redis is here, and it's here to stay. So continues with the philosophy of, hey, if you don't want to use these parts of Django, you don't have to. But hey, this is a kitchen sink batteries included framework. So, if you've learned your Redis and, you need to build a Django application, here's the built-in support, and here's the built-in documentation as well. All right, where are we today? So we finally made it. We're on 4.1 today, and as they went with Semver, the amount of change between versions, it's got less in quantity, but it allows for developers to really spend their time and cut their teeth and learn about each of these smaller changes, these smaller sets of changes. Sorry. With 4.1, the class-based views that I personally find to really enjoy building. Now those start. I believe now they have, in 4.1, a class-based view called async view. So, some of the other ones, the more pre-built ones, I don't think those ones are async capable yet. However, if you want to start to create, a class-based view that is async, well, you have a kind of a base class to start that off. And with 4.1, the ORM as well. I thought this was a really big one. Back in even the Django 2.x days, where ASCII was just stabilizing, people were saying, Django, like, let's make that ORM async capable. It's gonna be all this performance for free and whatever. Obviously, you don't get performance for free just by making things async capable. And I know that with the Django ORM, there were a couple challenges around making it async capable. So mid-August 2022, they were able to start to make certain portions of the ORM async capable. So where it can be used, it is nice to be able to get the benefits of your async aware code. Really just, I think, a great milestone for us to be at today. And, by the time this video goes out, I'm sure, the release notes for Django 4.2 are going to be even more detailed, even more fleshed out. So we'll go into the future bits in a bit here. But yeah, that's the major milestones of Django as of, this EdmontonPy presentation. All right, so my opinions about Django. I think I can't really remember how long I've used Django for. I think it's been about 3 years, I want to say. So again, these are probably a lot of just personal hot takes. So don't take my word as gospel. Form your own opinions. And no one's holding you to forcing you to use Django long term or short term or any term whatsoever. But here we go. I get a question a lot because as developers, especially when you're starting out, you want to try to use the latest and greatest. So the biggest question I always get asked is Django still worth learning? They hear about this ASCII thing and Django not really adopting it as much. And they feel like, okay, just because Django isn't, well, with 4.x, it's gotten a lot better. Notwithstanding, Django has to, support, allow for projects from, 2008 to be able to upgrade from Django 1 all the way to Django 4. So it's got some legacy to also have to deal with there. Despite all that, I think that Django is definitely still worth learning. Of course, I'm biased. I've been able to build, I started my career in software development by building, Django applications for, large and small clients. And I personally think that what really allows me to continue to recommend that Django is worth learning is because, as we can see with the major milestones, it is still being supported not only by the open source community, but actually by a non-profit organization called the Django Software Foundation. And having a not-for-profit that focuses on not only the present day, but kind of the future of Django itself. Not every framework can really, they would love to have, that kind of support. And Django, I think, is the community is very fortunate to have something like this. And based on what I saw as I was creating this presentation, the Django Software Foundation is still hiring, for their positions, and I thought, that's pretty cool. Again, there are a lot of frameworks that don't have a not-for-profit organization that can kind of, be the stewards for its framework. So I think it speaks volumes about, if you do learn Django, that maybe, I mean, we can't predict the future too far ahead, but I'm confident that it's going to be a framework that, continues to stand the test of time. Another thing that I hear about a lot is, well, Python, not a fast language, very slow, never wins performance benchmarks. Well, I guess my take on that is you're not wrong. You really, a lot of people who say that, they're not wrong. We can pull up benchmarks that show if you wrote your web application in C#, in C++, in C, you're going to get, just from a raw performance benchmark perspective, a faster application. But in my experience, I feel that development time, learning curves, developers solving problems and being able to not just minimize the incurring of tech debt, but also how easy it is to pay down. These are the things that usually are more important and exceed performance, like raw performance considerations. So, I could wax poetic about my take on that. As someone who, when I first started out, I thought, yeah, all these performance benchmarks, right? Like, why am I on this slower framework? But once again, a lot of times in my experience, it was what makes Django slow. It's a poorly written, query statement. It's a poorly written template. And these are things that I can't necessarily blame just Django for. Those mistakes can also be made in other frameworks, especially in frameworks that don't give you the kitchen sink. And as we go into some of the packages that I like, some languages and frameworks may not even give the developer the tools to even be able to pinpoint, where is my bottleneck? So again, I would say that, performance benchmarks aren't everything. I really do think that it is the developer's learning curve, the profiling tools, and, just being able to look up things on the internet. Those are more important to me than just winning a performance benchmark. The other thing too, like I mentioned in the news, is that Python itself has been getting faster. So I don't think it will ever be as fast as C++ or pure C, or I mean assembly, and whatever with zeros and ones, or quantum computing, who knows. But it is getting faster, and I think the considerations, the bottlenecks, are usually in other places when building web applications. I keep talking about this, and I just wanted to really have a slide devoted to this, is that when I started my career, I quite literally started with what still exists as the official Django tutorial. And even from that tutorial, it starts developers off on a good path of writing safer, cleaner code. Being able to say, don't repeat yourself, having patterns that when you learn them, you can reuse them over and over and over again. Even in the earlier versions of Django, they would have deprecation warnings. They would have, saying, hey, look, this feature or this module that you're importing in this version, it's going to go away two, minor versions from now. So I still feel that Django does a great job of helping not just new developers, but all developers who use Django, continue to write safer and cleaner code that is, maintainable, because of so many reasons. But I'm gonna have to leave it here. I also, just before I get into some of the criticisms, talk about the packages that I've enjoyed, in my couple years of developing in Django. The Django debug toolbar, when I was talking about performance benchmarks versus bottlenecks are elsewhere. Well, with the Django debug toolbar, you're able to have a visual kind of SQL query inspector. So if you have written a query set call, I will basically say that your first time writing a query set, you're probably not going to get the most efficient query out there. But it's nice to have a tool that visually kind of breaks down, okay, where did the database spend the most time performing a database operation? And I, started to take for granted how useful having that inspector was, so that I could say, oh, oops, here I should probably do a select related, or oops, here I should probably do a prefetch related, or even start to use, those queue statements, or what have you. But before it became sort of automatic, I got better and better at writing more efficient queries by using Django debug toolbar. And similarly, not only with your ORM queries, but also with your template rendering, there could be really big for loops, and in those for loops, you're not supposed to, but I have seen before that query set calls are being made in a template. Well, the Django debug toolbar also has a profiler to break down where in the template rendering pipeline is Django itself, or not Django itself, but like where the code you've written in Django, where is it spinning its tires? So I consider that to be a very close second. And yeah, Django debug toolbar, still active, still kicking, despite a lot of things now moving to kind of API driven backends. I believe you can still have the Django debug toolbar in those API explorers. So still extremely useful tool, and not every application has to be a single page app. So if you're still using the good old Django templates, this Django debug toolbar, when you're developing applications, so useful. I put it as number one because, man, it's still one of my favorites of all time. Of course, because Django started off as a CMS for a news company, now in modern times, there is an entire company built around maintaining Wagtail CMS, and we've got some pretty big organizations who are using Wagtail to this day. I couldn't list them all, but I thought highlighting NASA, Google, and the NHS here might get a couple eyeballs to take a look at Wagtail. Some people might ask, is this free? Yep, Wagtail is free and open source. So something that, NASA, Google, NHS, they trust their products, their websites, where they need to use a CMS. They choose Wagtail. I thought that was pretty cool. And of course, because I had the aside about Django REST Framework in the major milestones, well, um, still kicking, still getting version upgrades. Its API isn't changing as much because, again, it started off on a really good foundation. But I had had a lot of enjoyment building APIs using Django REST Framework. I really do see it as a stalwart that if businesses have applications that run in Django and they want to convert those applications from using, let's say, template rendering to more single page apps, they don't have to throw out the Django code. They can instead enhance it using Django REST Framework and be able to build something that still works in this single page app filled web development world that we live in today. Okay, criticisms time. As I look at some of these things, because it's a kitchen sink framework, it's really tough to say whether or not it's good or bad, right? But sometimes developers like to say, look, I want the knowledge that I develop in a framework or whatever tool or language that I use. I want that knowledge to be portable. I want to be able to say, not lock myself in to be a Python developer for all of my career. I want to be able to take the concepts I learned in Python and port it over to C#, Java, I don't know, Ruby. There's just so many languages out there. And I guess one thing that I will have to say is that Django to this day still relies on its own ORM, its own object relational model definitions. And that means that knowledge base, all that expertise built around the Django ORM, it's harder to transfer it to another. In my personal experience, I wanted to learn SQL Alchemy as it's another Python ORM, but it was so different from Django's ORM. So, I started wondering, for better or for worse, and I don't think it's fair to SQL Alchemy, I started wondering why other ORMs just aren't like Django's. But again, I think that's just because I built so much experience around being able to just naturally write an efficient query using Django's ORM, which, in one, to look at it positively, that's to Django's credit, right? And lately, what I've been able to do is I've mitigated that by, instead of saying, I'm fighting a framework, I don't know how to do it, I take a step back and I try to understand what my use case is and kind of make my problem a bit more generic. Before I think or say things in code, I instead kind of, if I'm to, explain it to a non-technical person, that's kind of how I like to, think about my problems and I would say that helped me port over, I guess, the more foundational things that I learned as I used the Django ORM. For example, how prefetching certain things in your SQL statements, that's important. That's a foundation that, despite SQL Alchemy having a slightly different, or just a different API, being able to take a step back, abstract that problem, that helps to port that knowledge base to something else. Another one is this was mitigated starting with Django 1.8, but Django's own built-in template engine, it does get far more attention. There are more tutorials, there are more guides, and there are more third-party packages which are coupled to Django's template engine instead of the venerable ones like Jinja 2. But again, I wonder if it's because I cut my teeth in the built-in template engines, but I start to wonder sometimes why other template engines just aren't like Django's. Yeah, I guess this is really the one that I'm a bit more critical about. It would have been nice to have Django kind of has started with kind of a more agnostic approach to templating engines. Of course, with Django 1.8, they had official Jinja 2 support as well. So yeah, they did step up, they did improve in that way. But I personally kind of started, my Django journey, I think in Django 1.2, and went on from there. So again, it's just that knowledge base, how easy it is to port over. Jinja 2, honestly, if you kind of look at it, it does look very similar. If you've never seen it before, Jinja 2 is actually quite similar to Django's built-in template engine, but there are just enough differences that I'm just like, sometimes when I write Jinja 2 templates, I'm going, why isn't it like Django's? But hey, that's for better or for worse. Okay, this one I think don't know how much I can really blame Django for. I think that Postgres, which is another free open source technology, but this Postgres is a relational database. It competes with your Oracle DB, your Microsoft DB, MySQL, MariaDB, so on and so forth. I think that Postgres has always led the way in kind of having more new technologies with the relational databases than the other relational databases. So I believe when I was looking at kind of the statistics, I think over 40% of Django applications today still use Postgres, and I think the other like 40% uses MySQL, which I thought was fairly interesting. But it reached a point where starting in, I think, Django 1.8, there were just, Postgres was just, at that time, this was what, I can't even remember what year Django 1.8 was, but during that year, I believe Postgres was just way more like ahead of just everyone else in the relational database game, and the community, most people were using Postgres. So other Django communities and the software foundation said, fine, we'll create Postgres specific model fields. And I don't know, I felt like to be critical about this, how Django was in a rock and a hard place. Why aren't the other competing databases at the time as feature filled as Postgres? Or, if there are, where are the members of the open source community that could contribute, time and effort to build MySQL specific model fields, for example? At that time, Django had to make a pretty tough decision. And, I personally built a lot more applications with Django using Postgres. So to me, for my career and my the clients that I helped assist, this was actually a net benefit. But I can definitely see from an outsider's perspective why this is a valid criticism of Django. At the same time, though, Django has first-party support for multiple different database backends. It's just that certain model fields are specific to Postgres, but like we saw in the major milestones, things like JSON field, when the other databases get those technologies, so will Django. They will make that agnostic as the other databases catch up with Postgres. Yes. So Django is very coupled to relational databases as your storage solution. And again, I think that the developer community, this is about hot takes, right? No SQL, this promised land of we don't have to do migrations. We don't have to even, set our tables and relations in stone. We can just, dynamically change our schema. All this sounds really great. And honestly, in certain cases, it is really great. But, I guess if I had to counterpoint these things, now that we can use our relational databases and have a JSON field, you might be able to get away with your NoSQL benefits inside a relational database. It might feel really weird and janky. I'm just saying you can probably get away with that. Now I also do have a bone to pick about just this like schemaless thought, and the lack thereof. Because in my experience, teams that do not think about their domain that their problem exists in, that who are the actors in this problem, the teams that start applications using schemaless data stores eventually pay that technical debt either in the code that they have to write in the application logic, or they actually pay the migration tags in their JSON and or YAML or whatever NoSQL, final data at rest language, whatever it is. They pay that price eventually. So this promised land of we'll never have to migrate anything, we'll never have to define, things that are set in stone. Once, in my opinion, an application or a service starts to have more adoption by other users, other companies, other services, you need to establish contracts, and you need to be able to give the actors who rely on your services, you got to give them the heads up that, hey, we can't just be making these changes willy-nilly. So the lack of NoSQL support with Django, I think that this is just kind of not to dig on anyone who's new into the field, but it can be natural to say, hey, relational databases, they've been around, they're old school, why are we still doing things this way? But I don't fix what is not broken. And I think that if you're able to define your schemas, we're not here to force you to, once you have those data schemas, to require using relational databases. You can use other frameworks that do integrate with NoSQL, databases. But still, I would say to this critique, very valid. Django still doesn't have, I think, any first-party database backends for NoSQL. I just don't think that their ORM would, be able to work in a NoSQL world. So, yep, totally valid criticism, I would say, about Django. So again, they want to be forwards compatible. Django has legacy implications around it. It's async and await support. I don't know how much of this is really Django's fault right now, to be honest. I think that this is more about kind of the tutorials, the guides, and the community, the content that's being written or has been written, obviously, with Django 4.x being the most recent version, 4.0 being the latest LTS. Async has improved, but this also means that the adoption needs to start first from the seasoned veterans in Django, and then some of them will write content, guides, and tutorials, and that I feel like that flywheel is just starting to turn, and I think this is a very short-term criticism, but it's also one that, hey, I just want to remind people that ASCII async is not just some free magical performance enhancer. You can still write bad code with async await. For example, a bad, and I put async, any bad ORM query will be super slow. That, even before ASCII was a thing, was an issue. I'm a culprit of writing, poor ORM queries, and this was before the ASCII days. Even if you use an async ORM query, if it's poorly written, if you don't use tools like Django Debug Toolbar, your bottlenecks are not necessarily with any sort of lack or difficulty of using async await with Django. And the other thing too is they consciously haven't, I guess we'll never really know, but Django channels is another Python package that is supported by the Django Software Foundation. And it does supercharge Django's ASCII capabilities. It tries to take the concepts like Django views, and I believe it abstracts it out to not just HTTP as a communication protocol, but they kind of say, what, a Django view can be seen in the async world as a Django channel if you are to use Django channels. And obviously, the documentation does a way better job of describing what I'm trying to summarize. But I think that if anyone has built up their expertise around how Django works, they've tried their best to make that domain transferable to Django channels, which can allow you to make Django support other communication protocols like WebSockets, and so on and so forth. All right, that's I think all the hot takes I could kind of come up with. So, let's talk about the Django community itself. So, talked about the Django Software Foundation, but I talked about who's used Wagtail CMS, but just outside of Wagtail CMS, who else is using Django? I believe to this day, Pinterest, Instagram, Udemy, big names, many more use Django behind the scenes. Maybe not for everything, but definitely large enough that they're showing up on StackShare, and they wouldn't advertise that they're using Django if they weren't proud of it. If Django didn't help them solve many important problems, many difficult problems. So, yeah, anyone who uses Django is in good company. That's the point I'm trying to make there. There are so many people using Django, so many companies, so many teams using Django, that it's big enough to not have just one, but two annual conventions. And I think with in person kind of still being touch and go, different personal preferences notwithstanding, it's great to see that Django has such a vibrant community that there is a Django Con in the US, and there's also a Django Con in the EU. So I provided links, I believe, to the upcoming 2023 conventions, but they also have the archives of really great talks, really great presentations. They have the archives online. So DjangoCon, massive convention, so big they needed to have 2 every year. Another organization and community that I really want to shout out is Django Girls. And Django Girls is a not-for-profit who, they're starting making kind of what I like to see as a grassroots effort by empowering and helping women organize free one-day workshops to allow other women to get introduced to web development and Django, and just from that simple one-day free workshop, who knows, because I didn't know that my career could continue, just by having, I really want to give Django Girls a special shout out, because just from that free one-day workshop, who knows, for the individuals who participate, the sky is the limit. Just wanted to give a special shout out to Django Girls. I think their mission is an important one, and we're super glad that they exist. Of course, a little closer to home, our community for EdmontonPy. Currently, you can find us. We're part of the Dev Edmonton Society umbrella, so that's what this YouTube channel is about. I just wanted to say that you can find us in the meetup EdmontonPy, as well as the Django channels. So find us there if that tickles your fancy. Okay, near the tail end now. So the future of Django, I suppose. This is kind of my opinion, but I think it's a pretty safe one to make. I think that it's looking forwards compatible. And to me, that is probably what makes Django, still a framework that I recommend, because Django's seen it, the community's seen it, going from CSS being a new concept back in 2003 to now we've got, CSS precompilers, Sass, JavaScript is not even JavaScript anymore. There's TypeScript now, where the web is always continuing evolving. There will always be new web technologies, and it's true. Django just won't be the first to adopt them. Um, but what I experienced and what I think, you know, I and many people who choose to learn and continue to enjoy Django is Django will continue to, adopt technologies while ensuring that our websites keep on trucking along. And um, as developers, as technical experts in this industry, we are told, you have to constantly learn. You have to be on your toes. You got to keep up with the latest. And because we're forced to learn so much so quickly, I started to appreciate just Django's stability. And I had never really felt rushed to, say, oh no, a new version of Django's appearing. I better, get really familiar with and this tough learning curve. Not a single moment. I think probably the roughest time was going from, the South migration library to Django's migration. But hey, that was back in Django 1.7. Now we're talking Django 4.x and next year Django 5.0. So that's all water under the bridge now. All those foundations, all those, lessons learned, they were done, half a decade ago. So, the philosophy of having a stable API, having a forwards compatible framework, it's getting better. It always was really good, but it's only getting better. But, it's probably unwise to, put yourself in a box, put anyone in a box. And so, even myself, after, Django nodding for a little over 3 years, and really enjoying Django REST framework and, being asked to develop a lot of single page applications, I started thinking, I don't really use the Django forms much. I don't use Django templates. I, really enjoy the Django ORM. I enjoy Django REST framework. Now, if I was to trim, if I didn't need the kitchen sink, what else is out there? So more recently, I and a lot of Python community members have explored Fast API, and it might be sacrilege to mention a non-Django, framework in the history of Django, but I think that it's good to expand your horizons. I think that it's good to be able to evaluate your different tools for your different jobs. If I was to make a dig at Fast API, I'll be completely frank here. I don't even think this is a hot take. If you go to like Django's documentation website, they got a tutorial, they got links, they got just a bevy of official, correct documentation. You go to Fast API, they did a fine job. It's continuing to get better, but I honestly struggled with that SQL Alchemy tutorial. I felt like that was a step backwards from being able to learn Django's ORM. Don't know how much of that is a criticism of Fast API or SQL Alchemy or just the fact that I've spent more time in Django. But look, I think that the quality of the documentation in Django is just way like leaps and bounds better than anything that really exists for Fast API. That is not to say that you cannot build a successful Fast API application. There are, Fast API, because it didn't have the, consequence of having to be backwards compatible or have all that legacy considerations. It started off being async capable. It started off, having, crazy performance speed in Python because it uses, ASCII right off the bat. So yeah, again, different tools for different jobs. Great to expand your horizons, explore your other frameworks, your other languages. I will never ever stop people from doing that. That is how you're able to kind of remain relevant in this industry that is constantly changing. But what I will say is that I am grateful that I learned Django before Fast API and not the other way around, because I think I was able to take what Django, its documentation, its community, don't repeat yourself, reusable patterns, security considerations. I was able to be introduced to those things within a Django context. And then once I went to a micro framework that doesn't have the kitchen sink, doesn't have the batteries included, Fast API, I was able to say, hey, hold on, just because this, micro framework doesn't have this, it's still important to think about, cross-site scripting. It's still important to think about, whether or not an ORM is a good thing. And if there's an ORM, what is my migration tool for that, those Python, data model classes that are supposed to map to, an SQL relational table. So yeah, I just wanted to conclude here with just my closing statement that, I spent time kind of breaking down the history of Django. Why? Because, I don't know, I think that it is and will continue to be a venerable web framework for perfectionists with deadlines. And if by watching this video I've piqued your interest, I know this wasn't really a tutorial on Django. There are many really great tutorials, and I have a link in the video description and in the slides here to an official one. And that's personally how I started. And if that doesn't work for you, there are so many other tutorials that are around Django REST framework. So just wanted to end there. It was interesting to be able to see, how long Django has been around. I did not realize that, it was, 20 years ago that the really beginnings of Django were formed. And yeah, I really enjoyed creating this presentation, and I hope you enjoyed listening and watching it as well. So thank you for your time, everybody, and we'll end it here. Thanks again.